Hello and good morning, and welcome to this Newlines Institute for Strategy and Policy discussion on Central Asia and its geopolitical significance. My name is Caroline Rose. I am a senior analyst and the head of the Power Vacuums program here at Newlines Institute, and I am very excited for what will be a very timely and valuable discussion on U.S. policy in this very important region. With me today, I've got four esteemed experts that have studied not only the region, but its stakeholders and its geopolitical significance, its political landscape, its political economy, and of course, its evolving security landscape. Dr. Erica Murat is an associate professor and chair of the Regional and Analytical Studies Department at the National Defense University with extensive experience on violence, mobilization, terrorism, and security institutions in Central Asia. Dr. Murat is the author of 3 books: The Politics of Police Reform, Society Against the State in Post-Soviet Countries, The Military and the State in Central Asia, From Red Army to Independence, and The Tulip Revolution, Kyrgyzstan 1 year after. Dr. Jennifer Brick Murtazashvili is the director of the Center for Governance and Markets and is an associate professor in the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Pittsburgh and a non-resident scholar at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace with extensive policy and field experience studying the nexus of governance, security, and development across Afghanistan and Central Asia. Dr. Murtazashvili is the author of Land, the State and War, Property, Institutions, and Political Order in Afghanistan and the Informal Order and the State in Afghanistan. Dr. Daniel Markey is a senior expert on South Asia at the United States Institute of Peace and a senior fellow at Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies and their Foreign Policy Institute with nearly 2 decades of academic, think tank, and government experience in U.S. policy in Asia. Dr. Markey is the author of China's Western Horizon, Beijing, and the New Geopolitics of Eurasia, and No Exit from Pakistan, America's Tortured Relationship with Islamabad. And finally, my colleague, Dr. Kamran Bukhari, Newlines Institute's Director for Analytical Development with 15 years of experience in the private sector intelligence space, with a focus on extremism, counterterrorism, political Islam, geosectarianism, and political systems in the Middle East, Central Asia, and South Asia. Dr. Bukhari is also a national security and foreign policy specialist at the University of Ottawa's Professional Development Institute. Dr. Bukhari has served as the coordinator for Central Asia Studies at the State Department's Foreign Service Institute and is the author of Political Islam in the Age of Democratization. So thank you, all of you, for coming all this way to our DC office to have what will be a really great discussion on U.S. policy in Central Asia and some of the changes that we've been witnessing in the region. Now, before I start, I'd also like to thank our audience members for tuning in. We will have a question and answer session at the end in the last 15 minutes of this discussion. So if you are watching from Zoom, make sure to raise your hand and submit a question in that portal, and we will be sure to get to it. So I'd like to start off with some of the changes that we've seen in the region over the past month and a half, and really in the months before that as well. Let's start with the United States withdrawal in Afghanistan and the security implications there. That certainly has changed the imperatives and the constraints of a lot of Central Asian republics, but then also key regional stakeholders and great powers that have interests in this region. And then, of course, there is now a potential for violent overspill for a lot of these states that are in the region and that have, of course, increased concern from stakeholders and actors. And then with this, there has been opportunity for a lot of great powers and new regional stakeholders to increase their influence, increase their leverage in the region as well. And so there's a lot to discuss in regards to not only Central Asian states, but also China, Iran, Russia, and a slew of different stakeholders. And so these shifting conditions, it begs new questions about the United States' current levels of engagement, its posture, and the future of its grand strategy in Central Asia in both respects to its regional policy and then also its strategy with great power competition. And so I would like to start off with all of you really outlining us the imperatives of Central Asian republics in the wake of this withdrawal and in the wake of some of these new security, political, and economic challenges. And if we could go around starting with you, Jen, and then ending with Kamran, that would be great.
Sure, thank you, and it's just a real honor and pleasure to be here with all of you in real life. What a change of pace, and especially someone from Pittsburgh. It's a real treat to be here. So I'd just like to talk a little bit about the changing dynamics in terms of Central Asia, and typically we hear of Central Asia as this land of the great game, of the Silk Roads, of great power competition. And I think what we've seen over the past several years, and I'd be curious to hear all of your reactions to this, is increased agency by the states of Central Asia in determining their own foreign policy. That as we see the U.S. withdrawal from the region, we're seeing an increased regionalization of foreign policy and relations among states. So the fact that the U.S. has left, this came as no surprise to anyone. The pace of the collapse of the Afghan state was certainly surprising, but the fact that the Taliban would somehow come to power, I don't think surprised most of the Central Asian republics. We recall, President Obama announced his withdrawal from Afghanistan in 2009. The U.S. has been withdrawing strategically from the region really since then. And so when President Trump was in power, he talked a lot about the withdrawal. President Biden was pretty clear and consistent when he was running for office about his desire to leave. So I don't think Central Asian republics were that surprised that the Taliban have this position. So what does that mean? It means that countries like Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan in particular engaged in quite active diplomacy with the Taliban for the past 2 or 3 years. So the Taliban is no stranger to them. And in fact, I think there was increased disillusionment with the role of the United States, the inability of the U.S. to maintain any kind of control. Over the past 7 or 8 years, we've seen northern Afghanistan really slip into chaos. And 1/3 of the population of northern Afghanistan has been displaced since 2013. That's an awful lot of disorder. And if the U.S. couldn't guarantee this, Central Asian republics are looking more towards their southern neighbors on their own terms to try to find a resolution to this. As the international community engaged with the Taliban, the Doha process really opened the door for the Central Asian republics to engage with the Taliban, in particular Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan, which did this quite actively. Tajikistan, obviously, less so, and we could talk about that in a little bit. But economically, there were economic changes inside of Uzbekistan. And Uzbekistan, the reforms after the death of President Karimov in 2016 really opened the door for a new foreign policy that was based on trade, not on autarky, but on trade. And once the Uzbek government took that position, it made engaging with the Taliban sort of an economic imperative because they began looking at regional integration and all these positive results and relationships with Afghanistan. So although the withdrawal was shocking, the way it happened, I think the Central Asian republics were actually much better prepared for what has happened than maybe many of us in Washington or here in the U.S. may appreciate.
Thank you.
Sure. So yes, I agree with everything what Jen said. Taliban is not new for Central Asian countries. They've seen Taliban rise to power in the 1990s when Central Asian countries were already independent countries. And today, these are strong states that have consolidated centralized power, control the territory of their states, so the entire territories, unlike in the 1990s, for instance, Tajikistan in the 1990s, and have strong leaders in power. All of Central Asian countries are authoritarian countries, so there is no illusion about that. But they are making a difficult calculation in regards to Afghanistan. Of course, on the one hand, there is expectation from Russia to recognize the Taliban. But more importantly for Central Asian countries is to make sure that Taliban collaborates with Central Asian regimes and contains radicalism within Afghanistan, especially radicalism stemming from ISIS-K, ISIS Khorasan, that that has a lot of members from Central Asian countries who earlier were part of ISIS, the main ISIS, and then they fled to Afghanistan once ISIS collapsed in Syria and Iraq. We don't really know how many people, how many ethnic Uzbeks and ethnic Tajiks are part of ISIS-K, but that is a real threat, at least as perceived by the ruling regimes. To remind everyone, there are 5 Central Asian countries, and 4 of the Central Asian countries, they extended support and recognition to the Taliban. Uzbekistan was the first one, followed by Kyrgyzstan, then Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, and Tajikistan is the only holdout in not recognizing Taliban, but also supporting resistance in Panjshir, mobilized by ethnic Tajik fighters. And I want to also bring another point here that makes the calculation for Central Asian countries difficult is the possibility, the potential for domestic radicalization. And usually I'm really careful about securitizing the whole issue of religion in Central Asia, but it's a real thing now, unfortunately, that some economically disempowered, socially immobile, religiously suppressed groups in Central Asia might sympathize with the Taliban and see an inspiration in having a political power just across the border, elevating the role of Sharia to the state politics. And that might give some inspiration for, again, economically marginalized groups of population in Central Asia.
Thank you. Dr. Markey?
Sure, yeah. Well, Jen and Erica have already covered a lot of territory, and so I just wanted to pick up on a couple of their points, and to first of all raise the observation that you might think that this is, as Jen put it, this is not a surprise to the region, and I agree with that generally. But the way in which it happened and the tactical, the way that Afghanistan fell at the end surprised even Afghans, surprised even the Taliban, I would say. It certainly has surprised the region. And what's important about that is not that that all of the Central Asian states aren't in a better spot now to deal with it than they were 20 years ago. They certainly are. But that there's still such deep uncertainty about what happens next. So the story of Afghanistan is hardly over. Things can easily go off the rails from here. And the consequences of where we go now, either in a sense a rosier story, at least from the region's perspective, of Taliban consolidation, reasonable control over Afghanistan in a sense, keeping a lid on it, whatever the it is, whether it's radicalization, as Erica was pointing out, or refugees, as I think the region is also concerned about, or other problems that could come out of there. Keeping a lid on it would be sort of the rosiest version of that future. And I don't think that the region can be that confident. And so how they're responding now in terms of beefing up their own capacity for securing their own borders, seeking external help from others, including especially from Russia, but also to some extent from China, even from the United States in narrow capacity. These are all things that I think are definitely on their minds because of that depth of uncertainty. The other point, also picking up on Jen, she noticed or noted the centrality of regional agency. These are actors in their own right. And the only thing I would add to what she, I think, very correctly pointed out is that is not just true in terms of their dealings with the Taliban or of their past dealings with the United States. People like Alex Cooley and others have written about local rules of manipulating the United States. It is also going to be true of their dealings with China and with Russia going forward. So that's the space that I think we need to be continue to be attuned to as we watch this unfold.
Dr. Nakar?
Well, thank you so much for all of you coming, and you've pretty much covered the ground. I'd like to add a couple of points or sort of magnify the points that you all made. I think that definitely they have more agency, and I think that they find themselves in a situation, you rightly pointed out, that or at least alluded to, that the confidence in the United States to deal with this went down pretty sharply. And I think you mentioned that it didn't start in the Obama administration when the drawdown was. Now, Daniel is right. Look, nobody was expecting this to sort of collapse the way it did. Most people thought, well, look, this is going to be a new chapter of a civil war, and maybe 50-60% of the country will be Taliban, but the other side is not going to collapse. There's still going to be Kabul, still going to be the North. But all of those predictions sort of fell by the wayside. And so I think Taliban are facing catastrophic success, as you alluded. I mean, they don't know what to do now. They thought they had more lead time, so they didn't prepare for the day after. But Erica's right that these people have, the Central Asian states have had a lot of lead time to prepare for this. They've been engaged in negotiations, some states more than others. But I think that there's no matter how much you were preparing, the imagination was that we're not just going to be dealing with the Taliban. We're going to be dealing with Taliban and the others. The anti-Taliban are going to be in the mix. So that was sort of the broader, if you will, understanding of the landscape. Now that the Taliban are there, so we have, Dushanbe reacting the way they are, because this is the first time ever that the Taliban have actually put down roots in areas that are Tajik majority, ethnically speaking, in Afghanistan. So that buffer that existed between Tajikistan historically, even when the Taliban were in power, is no longer there. This is a new reality that they have to deal with. Uzbekistan is also, although it has a smaller border, but a much larger population. You talked about, religiosity being a social driving factor, and you mix that with disenfranchisement politically and economic, poor economic conditions. People begin to wonder, yes, we've moved away from the Soviet-style command economy, but where are we going? And then you can't sort of just say, okay, everything will be fine. I think the question for all states, not just Central Asian, countries like Pakistan as well, are how do you keep your republics insulated from an Islamic emirate that we just don't know how it will oscillate? What will it do? How will it behave? And so with President Mirziyoyev trying to open up gradually, albeit, creating more space, recognizing more space for religion, for society, in sharp contrast with what Karimov was doing, this creates vulnerabilities. Are people going to look at it and say, okay, maybe the Taliban, and there's inspiration that the Taliban, forced the United States. So there's something here. There will be forces saying, can we emulate something? They're not really happy with what they see. The only state that's insulated is Kazakhstan, because, and of course Kyrgyzstan, but Kyrgyzstan has gone through 3 different uprisings, so there is precedent there. But Kazakhstan is looking at it from the northern end and saying, the southern flank is all of a sudden looking really, really vulnerable. And yeah, there's geographic standoff, but for how long? So everybody's trying to find out tools. The Turkmens have the longest border with Afghanistan, but their population centers are far away from that border. But nonetheless, within their own realities, the different realities that they face, they're all feeling vulnerable, and they don't have a way forward.
Thank you so much. This is excellent points, and I want to touch a bit upon your point about regional autonomy and agency, because I think that's very interesting, because while there is that extent of agency and we're seeing a very different behavior among the 5 main Central Asian republics, we're also seeing that sense of vulnerability that you just mentioned. So there's this duality that these states are grappling with in the face of increased insecurity and violent overspill. And building upon that, this has forced a lot of these states to seek out alternative or strengthen existing security partnerships with regional and external stakeholders. And you mentioned in a recent piece about how there are constraints to increased regional cooperation. While there certainly is increased activity with trying to coordinate with each other, there are still constraints, economic development, and then also, of course, border disputes and existing political disputes. And so accounting for these constraints, and we'll start with you, Dr. Murat, what are the constraints that these Central Asian states are dealing with? And then on top of that, what kind of security partnerships will they most be seeking out? And is this going to, do you see, occur with China and Russia, or will they perform a balancing act, so to speak, with Western partners as well? And for example, this week there was the announcement that the Tajik president, he was going to be visiting Paris with Emmanuel Macron. That is a really great example of how there is many balls in the air with a lot of these Central Asian states. And so how are they going to balance that? What do you think?
So you're absolutely right that, to sum up all the comments, that it is a balance between vulnerability and agency. Yes, countries in Central Asia are able to play external powers against each other or take the best out of cooperation with China, Russia, United States. At the same time, there is real vulnerability. In Tajikistan, with Taliban being so unhappy with the politics maintained by Rahman, and also large parts of population, for instance, in Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan, possibly not supporting their country's leaders' stance on Taliban. So it is really different calculations for each country. But I think the guiding principle for each regime in Central Asia is survival. It is consolidating power in the new maintaining a strong grip on power in the new geostrategic reality with Taliban in power in Afghanistan, and seeing what makes best sense in this particular point in time. For Uzbekistan, it's really important to conduct orderly presidential elections this month. To present a sense of security, continuity, stability in Uzbekistan with the current regime. For Tajikistan, what's important is transfer of power from father to son. It's been a prolonged plan that was delayed for different reasons, but Rahman, I strongly believe that Rahman is trying to consolidate nationalistic sentiment in Tajikistan by resisting Taliban and demanding that ethnic Tajiks are politically represented in Afghanistan. And so these calculations, whether they are viable, including for countries like Tajikistan, I think it's actually, especially for Tajikistan, it remains to be seen whether they are going to be able to maintain the same politics of recognition or non-recognition in a year or in 2 years. But in terms of their security partnerships, I think there will continue to be the same dynamics as we saw in the late 2000s, for instance, with the U.S. surge of troops in Afghanistan, that the countries will try to take the best out of what is available to them, cooperating with Russia, cooperating with China, possibly seeing opportunities for cooperation with the United States, renewed military cooperation in Central Asia with the United States. All this is possible. Regional cooperation is more dynamic today, again because of the Uzbekistan's opening during Mirziyoyev. It's still fragile, and anything can happen. We saw that there was a conflict at the border between Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan earlier this year. So these kind of tensions, they continue to simmer in border areas, including, and it's fragile. So the regional collaboration, all the better than a few years ago. It is still, I'm not holding my breath on any kind of consolidated regional response to security threats.
Excellent. And building off of this point, Dr. Murtazashvili, I think that this is interesting because there's also this economic component, and you've done extensive work on the political economy of many of these states. And I'm curious, with now a Talibanized government in Afghanistan, there are going to be spillover effects upon the economies of a lot of these Central Asian states as well. And accounting for the points that you just made about the constraints for regional cooperation, there are there have been issues with economic development already. How do you see this playing out? What kind of vulnerabilities do you see? How will this affect governance in many of these states? And what is really your forecast for how this will play out?
Yeah, I mean, I've got more questions than answers, and I'd be curious to hear from all of you about this. We've talked a lot about vulnerabilities, and I don't want to play the devil's advocate too much here, but I'm seeing, at least in public, fairly confident actions by these countries in Central Asia towards Afghanistan, right? I mean, the bluster from Rahman doesn't indicate, perhaps mistakenly so, right? What we're seeing and what we're hearing are two different things. This is a leader who is not behaving as if he's frightened. In fact, he seems to be provoking the Taliban quite a lot with his words about the National Resistance Front. And the Taliban in response have said, we're going to deploy suicide bomb squads in Kunduz and Taha areas of the north. Putting some of those Tajikistani militant groups border regions in response to what Rahman did. So to me, this is a real puzzle for me. And I think that this kind of warrants a little bit more discussion on our part. Uzbekistan, the same way. It's they're looking towards. Their border is much smaller. They have a much stronger military force. They're concerned, obviously, about Tajikistan, and I think probably Tajikistan's behavior. We're not hearing very much about this, but I can imagine if we think about the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan, for example, they're certainly a weakened force, but if we look at the path that they took in the 90s to get into Uzbekistan, they went through through the Tajik border, the Afghan-Tajik border, into Sara Asyo in southern Uzbekistan, and that's how they through the Tajik-Uzbek border, right? So there were vulnerabilities that they exploited there that obviously are going to be concerning to the Uzbeks. So in terms of the economy, I think a lot of these countries are looking towards Afghanistan. They saw chaos. Uzbekistan, these are landlocked countries, right? Getting back to the political economy issue. So they want to diversify, especially Uzbekistan, right? So I think a lot of this is driven by the domestic political changes which have shifted the political economy of the entire country outwards rather than inwards. And that means looking to gains from trade, reducing transit costs. And for them, it's almost like back to the 90s vision in terms of, how people viewed Afghanistan. And this is something we're hearing a lot in the local media, but especially coming from Russia. It's like they're looking for a Kadyrov kind of figure, like a Chechen leader, right, who can impose. The Afghans are unruly. And it's funny, we have these debates about Afghan governance and should the country have decentralized or centralized. And a lot of us have argued that, at least I have, that a more decentralized approach would have yielded more stability. From the Russian media, you hear the opposite, a strong hand, centralized rule. In fact, the country wasn't centralized enough. So the Central Asian republics are looking at this as an opportunity, potentially, for the Taliban, if they can trust the Taliban, to impose this kind of centralized rule at very high, coercive cost upon the public, and then potentially they could get their trade routes or their this kind of transit can continue. It's obviously very risky. I don't think they're being naive about this, but I think that's one vision that they're taking. But to see that Tajikistan is obviously in a vulnerable position, I'm not sure Tajikistan really understands how vulnerable it is. If you look at some of the development indicators from Khatlan province in southern Tajikistan, some of the highest population concentrations, highest levels of poverty throughout Central Asia, and then we can't just draw a straight line to connecting poverty to radicalism and terrorism. We know that that's a mistake. But you can't help but wonder if there's refugee spillovers, the drought that's happening in the region, the real economic hardship that's facing these countries, especially Tajikistan as a result of COVID. Rahman's gamble doesn't make a lot of strategic sense at this point. And to me, it really is is quite confusing as to why he's taking this position. Another thing that comes to mind is, and I'm just sort of speculating here, is this, could Russia have a hand in this? Is there a sort of hedging of bets that Russia's using? They've traditionally supported the Northern Alliance, the Resistance Front, or groups associated with them. Russia shifted in recent years, but this is a way to continue that kind of dialogue, putting pressure on the Taliban to get them to, produce some kind of outcome that they think is desirable.
Very interesting, and I would like to revisit the securitization of many of these governments. And I know you wrote a very recent piece a few weeks ago about this. I would like to address that when we get to the policy recommendation section, but that's a very, very interesting point about the effects on these governments, on their behavior, how they relate to their populations. Also, of course, the militarization of these countries, even though they are, of course, looking for security partners. But I think that the discussion of the political economy is a really great jumping off point to talk about some of the work that you've done on the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative and the work that they're trying to, and the sphere that they're trying to create, the influence they're trying to carve out in this region. Do you think that China is looking at this region as a landscape for opportunity? Do you think that insecurity and instability, while of course concerning Beijing, do you think that this is renewing their push to strengthen the existing corridor that they have in Central Asia? And if so, what will their strategy look like?
Yeah, first of all, there's actually some debate, even in Chinese circles, on how to view this debate. That is, you'll see some Chinese. In fact, there was an op-ed in the New York Times not long ago suggesting that Afghanistan was a tremendous strategic opportunity for China. This is an extreme view that I don't think is reflective of a lot of other Chinese thinking. And where I would put my emphasis would be on China seeing Afghanistan and this region principally in terms of threats or concerns, and primarily relating back to what's happening inside of China and in Xinjiang in particular. And so it all relates back to sort of what could go wrong inside of China and make Beijing's life difficult. And you can draw a line between Afghanistan to Pakistan or through Central Asia, back into Xinjiang and back into China. So I think that's driving a lot of China's actual behavior. But I think that we also do have to see that over the past 10 years now, China has also seen certain opportunities in the region. You talked about the Belt and Road Initiative, and has wanted to advance a different agenda for regional connectivity, in particular, at times looking for alternatives of east-west flow across this vast Eurasian continent, alternatives that may not always include Russia, and so could include Central Asia as a consequence. So there are multiple layers to this, but I think we've sort of seen the rise of that in terms of the intensity of the announcement from Beijing going back all the way to 2013, and then a gradual kind of decline. And this takes me back to the point about local agency. Part of the other thing we've seen is that not everybody has been thrilled with China's greater involvement in the region. And what you've gotten is not just a kind of a Russian-led pushback, which you might anticipate from kind of a geopolitical perspective, but you've also gotten a localized exacerbation of perhaps latent xenophobia, plus concerns about just being swamped by China economically, that has led to a degree of skepticism about what China's up to. And the last point would be that's been further pushed by concerns about what China is doing to its own people, right? And so by the region's recognition that, in particular with respect to the Uyghurs, that they do not like that. That's not a popular direction to take. And so you're seeing, again, this sort of multiple overlapping and in some ways countervailing pressures on Chinese involvement in the region. So it's not a simple story of China just kind of sweeping in and taking over, contrary to what at least some Chinese analysts might have us believe.
Excellent. Building off of that as well, I want to add a few other dimensions into some of the regional stakeholders in Central Asia. And of course, that is Iran and Pakistan. And Dr. Wakari, you've written extensively on this dimension, not only with their relationships with the Taliban, but then also this burgeoning regional interest and the imperatives and constraints that they have there. Can you talk about Iran, which has been a bit of a wild card, really, in both Afghanistan and then also Central Asia, and then also what Pakistan, the levels of engagement that they would wish or they are strategizing to have in this region in relation to their Afghanistan policy, but then also in relation to the BRI that they've had with China and CPEC and a number of other infrastructural projects.
Let me just quickly add to what Daniel made a fascinating point here about how we may not be getting the Chinese how the Chinese are looking at Afghanistan. There's this tendency here to say, okay, now that the United States is out, Afghanistan is China's to do as it pleases. Not really. The Chinese built BRI and CPEC particularly at a time when the United States was underwriting security in the region. The United States was in Afghanistan making sure that whatever happened there just stayed there, and the Chinese benefited from that, which is why they pushed into CPEC. They pushed, you wrote an extensive book on it, that in Central Asia. And recently they said, hey, we have plans to do something similar for Iran, which extends 25 years, and they even put a $400 billion number to it. But then this happened. So now the Chinese are basically saying, okay, now what do we do? They're scrambling. Like everybody else, they're scrambling on how to find a new modus vivendi to deal with this Afghanistan, because there's nobody taking care of it anymore. So they're leaning on Pakistan, and they already have seen attacks on Chinese workers in Pakistan, and the Pakistani government and the media is reporting a rise in jihadist attacks on their soil after the coming to power of the Taliban. And so the Pakistanis, are looking at this and saying, how can we keep our Islamic Republic of Pakistan secure and safe with an Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan that has strategic depth into our areas along the western periphery? This matters for the Chinese because this is the CPEC corridor isn't too far from there. And so this is why there's a lot made out of he's now the former head of the ISI since yesterday, but when he went to Kabul, there was this thing about, oh, look, he's there having tea at the Serena Hotel, and the British journalist Lindsay Hilsum from Channel 4 even asked him that question, so what are you here for? And he said, don't worry about it. And, well, she didn't ask whether we should worry about it or not. You brought that up, which tells me you're worried about it more than anybody else. So, and this is why we saw that confab of, the Central Asian intelligence chiefs with the Russian head of intelligence and the Chinese and the Iranian all meeting together and saying, okay, we're all in it together. We need to figure this one out. So if we do things on our own, which obviously will happen, everybody will do things on their own, but we need to coordinate activities because it's in our mutual interest. So the Pakistanis right now, are having to deal with China in a way that the Pakistanis dealt with the United States. That the United States kept saying that, hey, we need more pressure from you guys on the Taliban in order to, deal with Afghanistan. While the Chinese are not waging war in Afghanistan, but they are saying, okay, these people, can we have, some semblance of an understanding? And it gets very complicated because for the longest time, the Taliban have been an insurgent force high on ideology, and all of this is new. Yes, it's great the Chinese can give us money, and somehow everybody's thinking that if we can create a dependency on the Taliban, that the Taliban need our economic relations, that may be a way to get these people to behave. Well, they're not ready for that yet. The Taliban are still sort of figuring it out. For them, governance means enforcing Sharia right now. And yes, it'll get to that stage where they're going to have to make sure that, the lights are on, gas is there, commerce is flowing, but it's going to be a while before they actually get the hang of this because this is not their skill set. And so that's where we are. The Iranians, it did something very interesting since at least 2005. They developed relations with the Taliban to diversify their existing relationships with the anti-Taliban. Remember, the Iranians nearly went to war with the Taliban 1.0 emirate after they killed the diplomats in Mazar Sharif in 1998 or 9. And so, but the Taliban, the Iranians understood that A, they wanted to have a leverage over the United States, B, they saw which way the wind was blowing, and they didn't want their rear flank to be, just ignored. And we now have a situation where they have some of their people, their people as in, people who they are connected to inside the Taliban organization, the movement, in, the Interior Ministry. The Deputy Interior Minister, the Deputy Defense Minister are two commanders, prominent ones, who have had a well-known relationship with the Iranians. The Iranians, interestingly, were able to secure two Tajiks and one Uzbek in the Commerce Ministry. This is important for the Iranians because, of all the countries that export goods to Afghanistan, Iran is the largest. And so they have that. They even got a Shia Hazara gentleman in the Deputy Health Ministership. So Iran right now, I think, is probably, if, this wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that of all the countries that are stakeholders and have borders with Afghanistan, I think Iran is probably in the best position because they have best of both worlds. They've got leverage here, they've got leverage there. Notice they just had like 4 trucks, large trucks, sent to Herat with food stuff. Then the delegation went to Kabul to meet. We speak so much of the sectarianism, but here sectarianism doesn't mean anything. They're doing business. So I think that there is a need to understand that the vulnerability of Pakistan, because it's a much weaker state, and Iran seems to be a bit more confident, to borrow from Jen, saying, look at their behavior. They're behaving far more confidently. They think they have agency and time is on their side.
If I may, I just want to jump in here because I think this is a really important point when we're talking about the political economy of the region. Uzbekistan has kept the power on. So Kabul and Afghanistan, so much of all of the electricity in Kabul comes from Uzbekistan. And for years, the U.S. was paying that bill, right? So paying the Uzbeks, paying the Afghan government to pay the Uzbek government for this electricity. Tajikistan as well. The Uzbeks said they're going to keep the lights on regardless of who's paying. We don't know who's paying that bill or if anybody's paying that bill, right? And this goes to the point of trying to economically normalize Afghanistan because they believe that this is the way that you can engineer the path to the future. I think this is the strategy that they're using is economic. That's why they're putting enormous pressure on the United States to unfreeze those bank accounts. They're the ones, bringing in the humanitarian aid. You're seeing the Uzbek media is talking quite a lot about the trucks that keep going, the Turkmen as well, the Iranians as well. The transport's continuing, the trade's continuing. This isn't going to stop. This is going to continue. That Afghanistan is now a normal country. Psychologically, right? That economically, because they have all of their hopes pinned on that, right? I mean, Uzbekistan signed a strategic partnership with Pakistan over the summer, and to me, that was all. When I saw that happen, to me, that was a sign that the Uzbek government had given up on the United States, and that was a month before the collapse. And that was right in front of Ashraf Ghani, right? Ashraf Ghani was in Tashkent, and Ashraf Ghani made this huge speech, right? Decrying Pakistan and Pakistan's involvement. And there go the Uzbeks signing a strategic partnership with Pakistan right in front of Ashraf Ghani. That was, to me, one of the biggest signs of the death knell of that government, that people couldn't rely on it. And economically, that's what they were looking for. So can they control the militant aspect? And I think that's a whole nother question.
And then to add to your point, didn't the Uzbek president give a statement to the media that Reuters carried as well, that we are, quote, in daily contact with the Taliban?
Yes.
So that speaks volumes about how their attitude is.
This is a really great segue to the U.S. strategy there. And you mentioned that even before the withdrawal, there were signs of lost confidence and, of course, trust in the United States as not only for security assistance and for aid, but also as a partner in the region. And we can already see that the United States is trying to gauge what new space there is in this region for it to not only influence, but also compete with some of the powers that are entering the fold. We mentioned China before. Russia has, of course, been a very dominant and very present a power in the region. There's that post-Soviet legacy. And so the United States, it's certainly tried to gauge where it can, posture itself. We've seen in the past 2 weeks that the United States was considering an offer posed by Russia to help and coordinate over intelligence at a Russian base, which I would love to hear all of your opinion about. But we've also seen the United States, try and determine its position on Central Asian republics amidst the securitization and militarization of their own governance systems. And I think for the Biden administration, human rights is incredibly important here. So I would like to start with you, Dr. Murat, actually, because you've written about this before, how there is concern now amidst the securitization of borders, finding new security partners, some security partners that have put out illiberal tendencies, do not have the same values as the United States. With that concern in mind, how should the United States approach these countries while trying to provide assistance, but at the same time trying to ensure that our values of human rights, democracy, electoral integrity, that is still upheld in the region?
Well, I hope U.S. U.S. is already repeating the mistakes it's made in the past, basically treating Central Asian countries as this outpost for military and security engagement for its national interests in Afghanistan, without really trying to build more long-term, solid, consistent relations with Central Asian governments, Central Asian societies. So treating as default partners when things are going really bad in Afghanistan. And this is evident in Central Asia, and therefore Central Asian leaders choose more reliable partnerships with Russia, although there is a lot to say about Russia as well, or China that comes with economic benefits as well. It is very important for Central Asia not to treat for United States not to treat Central Asia as those ad hoc partners when we need them, when they are in our interest, but try to address some of the security, economic, political issues that Central Asian countries and societies especially are facing in Central Asia. That can be education, economic policy, political transparency, human rights, and do it consistently. Do it not only in the quiet years when Central Asian strategic partnership is not needed. So let's say in between the surge period of late 2000s to now, when human rights were more important, so collaboration with civil society was more important. But in, let's say, 2008, 2009, U.S. policymakers only talked to regimes without really incorporating civil society groups. So be more consistent in that sense. Try to look for economic cooperation opportunities as well, and continue to support regional initiatives for integration. United States can really provide a lot of political influence, a platform for initiatives from Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan to strengthen political, economic ties in the region. So again, to sum up, be more consistent and viewing Central Asian countries as long-term partners and not those, case-by-case, case-by-case collaborators when we need them, when things are really bad in Afghanistan.
That's a great point. And, Kamran, you've written a piece in the Wall Street Journal, I believe it was 2-3 months ago in March or February, discussing how the White House, in an interim document on national security, how it didn't at all mention Central Asia. And Central Asia was very much absent from not only the strategy of, within a larger regional context, even in South Asia, but also in great power competition with China and Russia. And so, as we're mapping out, the U.S. policy in Central Asia, where do you think Central Asia should rank in the priority list for the United States as it approaches great power competition? And in the context of this, Russian base offer, do you think that that's a smart move? Do you think that that is wise to even explore joint U.S.-Russian cooperation and management and observation of Afghanistan? Or do you think that that is going down the wrong path?
Well, I mean, look, I think Erica is right. She explained it well, where when you need them, and what kind of response are you going to get from the Central Asians? I mean, contrast this, and even then, the driving force was we needed them, is the early U.S.-Kazakh relationship, where the whole denuclearization of Kazakhstan, sending in Chevron and ExxonMobil to help develop the oil export capability of the country, to get it on its feet. It was a young country, new, coming out of the rubble of the Soviet Union. But then somewhere along the way, we just sort of said, okay, done. Okay, we came to a point where we didn't see anything more to be done there. And the point that I was making in that piece is that you can't talk about China without having a strategy for Central Asia, because as Daniel wrote in his book, this is where the whole investment, if you look at where the Chinese are investing, we think in terms of the Indo-Pacific, because that's how we deal with things from a maritime point of view. But the Chinese aren't really competitors at that level yet, and they're not going to engage in countering our moves there point by point. Yes, they'll build up their capacity, but they're very realistic about how competitive they're going to get. This is why we have the BRI. The BRI is, what are you going to do with the Straits of Malacca and the U.S. fleet? Yes, it's great to send in 52 aircraft into Taiwan and to keep poking that and saying, okay, remember, we're here. But that's about it. But if you really want to build something and project influence and enhance your capability, your ability to export and import energy, that's where Central Asia is. And then that would explain everything that the Chinese have been doing. So I think the United States has to stop looking at this tactically. We're still thinking, even this whole thing of, how will the region be affected by the fact that we're no longer in Afghanistan? It's all through the frame of terrorism. But there's far more that's happening beyond terrorism, and that's not where Washington is thinking. And that's the sad part of what the Biden administration is doing. And it's not just a Biden administration thing. It's been a bipartisan problem for a long time.
Absolutely, that's a really critical point. How we have to essentially switch from viewing the region not only as a backwater, but you hear so often just the stands used, which I'm sure is something that is aggravating, especially as this region is rising in its geostrategic importance. Regarding China, though, and this is something I'm curious what your thoughts are, the Blue Dot strategy, with the Blue Dot network that the United States has proposed. It's a supply chain strike force, as the Biden administration characterized it. Would that be an effective strategy in Central Asia as the United States, if it does elevate Central Asia in its regional importance and it does start to incorporate it into the doctrine of its grand strategy? Do you think that it would have any kind of an effectiveness, not only in trying to deter Chinese economic influence, but then also, of course, trying to court a lot of these Central Asian republics, and then, of course, also promote American democratic values as well? Do you think that that would be a successful strategy, or do you think we're just not quite there yet with that proposal?
Well, we're certainly not quite there yet with that particular proposal. The Blue Dot Network is, you might say, a brand in search of an actual activity. So there's a name, and there's an idea, there's an impulse behind it, which is in many ways admirable, which is the idea that when it comes to building out infrastructure and investments in infrastructure in other countries, there ought to be certain standards, and that if you can establish a baseline for what you might call higher quality or high quality infrastructure, and then put a stamp on it that actually means that and is publicly recognized in that way, then not only might that privilege certain providers of that infrastructure, say the Japanese, the Europeans, the Americans, who may be more likely to adhere to those higher standards, environmental standards, labor standards, whatever else. But it might also help local publics judge the choices that are being made by their own leaders, right? That's the impulse behind it. Now, the problem is between identifying that impulse and actually making it into something that really exists, the countries that have been eager to do this have gotten stuck. It's not that easy, actually, to identify which of the various things you want to privilege when you identify something as Blue Dot. And different countries will obviously argue differently because they have different, they have their own national priorities when it comes to infrastructure. So say the Indians are eager to do this and the Japanese, but imagine Indian high quality infrastructure and the things that they're likely to privilege as compared to the Japanese. It's not going to be the same thing. Okay, so then try to take this whole idea to Central Asia, and now you've taken all of the problems that you've identified with a sort of so far non-existent brand strategy. It's not gonna go, at least not yet, and let's hope it does over time. But I think there's a nugget here which I think is worth exploring, and it relates to some of the points that have already been made. It has to do with the United States is not going to be the player in Central Asia. So we need to get over that. That's not going to happen. And I can also relate to the United States ought not to put its problem or assume that its problem of countering terrorism is the same thing that wakes everybody up in the morning in the region. Though it still is the Biden administration's problem. I mean, we can't underestimate the extent to which, if things go off the rail in Afghanistan, that results in problems security-wise in the United States, this administration will pay an enormous price for that, and they are acutely sensitive to that. So they need to find a solution to that pronto, and they may have to run through Central Asia. But the impulse behind what might actually work is trying to find space at the margins where the region is eager to engage with the United States. That's why Erica would mention something like education, right? That's something we're actually good at. It's something we have a lot of, and it's something that people in the region want. These are all good things. A very specific example, a delegation from Kazakhstan of academics came to Washington a few years ago. And what were they asking at Johns Hopkins University when they came to visit? Can we have access to the databases, not the super sensitive secret databases, just databases to do social science research, right? Is this the kind of thing that the United States could offer? And that relates then, again, somewhat tangentially, but eventually you get there to the questions of freedom and democracy and ideas. These things don't happen out of nowhere, but people who have access to education and to these resources are more likely to eventually get there. So that's where the United States, I think, can play. It's a very asymmetrical strategy. It doesn't go head to head with the Chinese or the Russians. And it identifies things that people actually want and pushes those.
That's an excellent point on education. And it kind of segues into my last question about how we can connect this, particularly with humanitarian aid. How can we utilize the United States strategy, Dr. Murtazashvili, how can we utilize that in Afghanistan, especially as we're trying to identify a policy there? how can we orient our policy towards Central Asian republics, not only to stave instability, to prevent the emergence of a major power vacuum, but then also try and provide aid to the many Afghanistans that were left behind and have to deal with the Talibanized government? And I'm sure it's a very loaded question, but how have you been thinking through that?
I think the question of aid and how to provide it. I don't have an easy answer to that question, unfortunately. There's a lot of things to balance in terms of unfreezing these bank accounts, the leverage that the U.S. may have, huge demands there's a huge humanitarian crisis right now. And, something that's really fascinating is that it's really striking the educated populations who are the office workers and the bureaucrats, much more than those, not that the rural areas are unscathed by any stretch of the imagination, but they have developed a kind of resilience to it because they're subsistence farmers, and so there's a kind of tolerance, unfortunately, that's during the billions of dollars spent on this reconstruction effort, you still have subsistence and vast levels of poverty in rural areas. But I want to play devil's advocate one more time here. I'm not sure that the U.S. has much credibility in this region. So we talk about constructive ways that the U.S. can engage. I'm not sure there's a lot of desire right now on the part of Central Asian republics. On the, the Taliban is obviously a different situation, and in fact, the U.S. has very strong relations with the Taliban, not formally, but they've developed them for many years in Doha. The U.S. is intimately involved in the Afghan economy because of the reconstruction efforts over the past 20 years. But when I look at the Central Asian republics, speaking with government officials, during the Trump administration, there was a lot of questions about the reliability of the U.S., even under Obama. This is not necessarily new, and real questions about, is the U.S. reliable? What is it trying to do? And then, so much work promoting democracy. And I did this. As someone who believes in democracy, I don't think the U.S. is very good at promoting it at the diplomatic level and at the operational level. And I think a lot of that language on democracy and human rights, countries have learned to tune out. I think Kyrgyzstan is a great example of this, that there was a real opportunity for engagement, for example, in Uzbekistan. But there has been very little investment there at a time when I think that new government really wanted it and was looking for more of a partnership. Real disappointment, I think, in the levels of investment that have been made. Education is probably one of the only areas, as Daniel has said. If we look at the state-building efforts in Afghanistan, I think the U.S. failed on so many fronts, but education was a real bright spot. But this was not just driven by international aid efforts. There was so much private investment in education. I think there's like 40 universities in Kabul, and most of them are private, and private schools all over the country. So it was the private sector that was driving education just as much as investments from the United States. But when we look at the engagements from Central Asian states, they're going to look to terrorism assistance, right? Counterterrorism. And this is going to be, once again, I think as Erica has pointed out, sort of that pleasure point between them. They're going to find that this is where the mutual interests lie, because the Central Asian republics are genuinely concerned about as Erica pointed out so rightly, so many Central Asians went to Iraq, they went to Syria, and now it's right in their backyard. We don't want to exaggerate the numbers of Central Asian fighters, obviously. We don't want to exaggerate that threat, as many people have. But the presence of Tajikistani militants who have come over very recently, from Afghanistan from Central Asia, from Tajikistan into Afghanistan, and these, brigades that the Taliban have deployed in the north are real causes for concern. But getting back to your question on humanitarian assistance, there's an ATM right now that the U.S. controls, and who's going to allow the Taliban government to start taking money out of that ATM? And what I'm seeing right now in terms of U.S. engagement on the humanitarian side, and I would love to hear your views on this, because this is what I'm seeing is that the Taliban is really using its leverage on human rights and women's issues with the United States, saying girls over seventh grade can't go to school for now. And they use that for now, I think, as a signal to the United States, as like, this is the thing that we're going to bargain with you over. And you open up the spigot, girls can go back to school. I can't help but think that that's part of this calculation. I may be wrong, maybe misreading it, but I think there's this very delicate dance around this issue of an inclusive government. They haven't declared a permanent government, and they're using what they know that the U.S. is going to respond to, which is human rights issues, gender issues. That's what's got the public so mobilized here in the United States. Yeah.
Sorry but I think this is fascinating, but then the question would be, what kind of a tactic is that? Because not in the moral sense,
Right.
of course.
No.
But is that really very effective? Why not temporarily allow women to go to school? In other words, look like the good guy, get the money, and then begin to clamp down.
That's a good question.
I mean, because what they're doing right now and what the United States' response and what the European response may well be over time, certainly the French, is to say, we do not like what we see at all. This is exactly what we were worried about. You're not living up to any of the things that we had in mind. If you could just live up to some of them, we could probably see through to beginning to open up that spigot, because we don't want the people of Afghanistan to suffer either. And you're exactly right. The people who are suffering the most tend to be the urbanites and so on, who were very connected to us. So we would like, I think there would be an impulse there to try to find a way through. But the choices that the Taliban are making so far I think, are more driven by internal dynamics of their own politics than by an eye to the negotiating process with us. Anyway,
I would think it's a little bit of both, right? Yeah. And then another way to think of it is, this is just the beginning, right? So then clamp down. This may be a liberal order, right? Like the clamping down, this
could get a lot uglier.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately.
No, I think you're both right. It is a bit of both. The leverage that the U.S. has is money. You need money, we can give it. You need to do certain things so that we can give you the money and not look bad at home. The Taliban are reversing that and saying, oh, we would love to take these people to school, these girls, but we just don't have the resources.
We can't pay the teachers.
We can't pay the teachers, and that satisfies a couple of things, is that you kick this can down the road because you don't want to lose your base that said, oh, but you were going to bring Sharia that you promised us. And this solves that problem. Plus, it's a way to try to extract and do business with the United States. And because right now the United States faces, and the international community faces, a dilemma. How do you reach the people of Afghanistan when the Taliban are standing between them and you? And so there is no formal recognition. Yeah, you can go through NGOs and the UN system and all of that, but at the end of the day, do you want to give them enough? How much money is too much money for the Taliban? Because you don't want them to take this money to do what they want to do.
Absolutely. And this also begs a question I would like all of you to really give your thoughts. With this increased humanitarian concern, clearly that there is a sensitivity to women's rights, access to education, access to being able to go outside, to be able to have a public life. And there's a lot of attention on this in Afghanistan. And I'm curious, do you think that, particularly in authoritarian structures in Central Asia, do you think that could be utilized as a way to, for example, try and court the United States for security assistance, knowing that that's where the attention span is, while at the same time recognizing that, human rights abuses may be ignored in a lot of these republics. I'm curious what your thoughts are, Dr. Murad.
So I think authoritarianism will take place in Central Asia despite the United States, and it's a global trend anyways. The rise of populism, including Kyrgyzstan is a great example for that. And I think this is the time now to separate what Central Asian states, so governments want, and what Central Asian society wants, so societies and civil societies in particular. The governments, of course, they don't want any of the democracy talk, transparency, fair elections talk. They don't want that. They're happy just to collaborate on security issues, to receive security assistance from whoever provides that. But for Central Asian societies, it is important to cooperate with the United States. And of course, the democratization programs, NGOization programs of the 1990s, they did not bring the results we hoped they would bring. But the conversations here in this town and in New York are continuing. How best can we empower civil society actors, people on the margins, for instance, disabled people, environmental activists, ethnic minorities, displaced people, how to best empower, or including, very importantly, journalists, independent journalists who reveal corruption, grand corruption schemes in the government. What are the best ways of empowering those actors in Central Asia? And there are many in Central Asia, and they do need cooperation and connections with their peers and governments in the West. And this is something that no other actor is able to support and to offer. So there is a role to play for United States and European Union in Central Asia. And I think that needs to continue to happen. That along with security cooperation, there has to be education and stronger ties, new types of connections with civil society actors as well.
Absolutely. Well, we have two questions, and I think that it's a great time to start tackling them. One from our audience about the U.S. military withdrawal in Afghanistan. It says, with the U.S. military withdrawal and its further dwindling involvement in Central Asia, is Central Asia an interest for the United States under the Biden administration? How can the United States compete with China's engagement in the region, particularly with the BRI? If we could go around from this end to that end about your thoughts about how the United States is handling Central Asia under the Biden administration. And I'll add kind of a bit, because I know we've touched on BRI before, we've touched on where this lies in the priorities. What in the next 6 months can the United States do in reorienting its Central Asia strategy?
I'm not sure the U.S. is interested in Central Asia. To be frank, the U.S., the Biden administration has packed up its bags and left Afghanistan as quickly as it could. And that tells Central Asia, I mean, what does that tell Central Asia? If U.S. strategy, and it's been pretty consistent across administrations, is if Central Asia is just a backwater to its security strategy in Afghanistan, what does this say? What's going to happen to, the trilaterals that the U.S. was working on in Central Asia? I don't know. Or they still exist if there's no Taliban anymore? I mean, that was a very interesting innovation. There was a real opportunity, I think, to expand that. The C5+1 could have been a C6. There were really that I think was sort of a bright light of U.S. engagement. But I don't see a vision. I don't see an interest. I don't see a heart. I think the U.S. is moving to the maritime world, the Indo-Pacific, the Quad, great space, the great power rivalry. I think just about anything but Central Asia, unfortunately.
I might disagree a little, especially if now the military elites, well, not the right word, but analysts are predicting that there might be national security implications stemming from Afghanistan within 1 or 2 years. Central Asians matter. Central Asians are the only countries, the only viable solutions, in addition to India maybe, who can actually support intelligence, security efforts in Afghanistan. It is a viable solution, but for this viable solution to actually take place, there has to be a more comprehensive approach to Central Asian countries, more consistent, not just the case-by-case approach, but more long-term partnership. The type of partnership we see take place between Western countries and Georgia or Ukraine. And me being from the National Defense University, speaking on personal capacity, I would say that invite more Central Asian military officers to study and to receive military education as opposed to just training that the United States have been conducting in Central Asia predominantly, and not really inviting enough mid to senior level officers to study strategy with with other Western partners, and from a Western perspective, not from Russian or Chinese perspective, from a Western perspective, understanding root causes of security problems and what we like to say whole of government approaches to security challenges.
Yeah, I guess I like the impulse here and the idea, but I come back to Jen's point. The Biden administration, I think, has signaled pretty strongly what its direction is, which is more or less out of Afghanistan, but also neighboring countries, and the exclamation mark on that, at least for the moment, is Pakistan. We haven't seen this kind of cold shoulder to Pakistan, and clearly from the White House directly in some time. Even the Trump administration extended a bit of a hand at various points to Islamabad. Biden has not, as far as we can tell, had an opportunity to speak to Imran Khan so far. And that's remarkable given all that's happening next door to Pakistan. So I think that and the other points that have been made suggest, this is the pivot to Asia, but meaning the Indo-Pacific, East Asia, Northeast Asia, and so on. And that may be the wrong thing to do, and we may come to regret it sooner or later, but that seems to be the direction. In terms of coming back and just meeting our bare CT needs, Erica's point may be right, that to develop a sustainable platform to do that over time would require that kind of investment. But I think that the scale of it is, in my mind, probably small. In other words, when the Biden administration looks at the CT problem emanating from Afghanistan that has the potential to have global significance, not just regional significance, which is far greater, but global significance, it sees it as relatively narrow and manageable from a relatively limited platform that you could establish in one or another of these states, and not necessarily in a grand, sort of sustainable fashion with political support from the government and so on. That's, I think, how they see it.
Already that would be an improvement.
That would be, right, that would maybe be beyond where we've been.
Yes.
Now, the problem is that if you combine these two things, a cold shoulder to Pakistan, which was the natural and normal partner for this type of activity in the past, we've had trouble with them, but their geography, the kind of sort of intel cooperation that we've had over the years, with all of its ups and downs, that's the place we would normally go, but we don't seem to be going there. So it seems like Central Asia gets the nod for that kind of narrow cooperation. Anyway, I'll leave it there.
And I would just say that, we'll look at Russia, and this is probably going to steal your thunder a bit, but China, Pakistan, Russia, there's Uzbekistan, right? We're seeing a pretty strong alignment here that doesn't leave a lot of space or frankly need for the United States. I mean, I don't want to say, what can the U.S. offer right now to these countries? And I really mean that from like a psychological perspective, not just a material perspective. The U.S. was badly defeated. Like, the U.S. was badly defeated and badly discredited in the region. And I don't, we think about that in the media and we watch those horrific videos, but if you're living in Central Asia and you saw that, what is the United States offering? You had all that money, so much time. What is the United States offering? It's not clear.
I think credibility is a big problem, and it's been building, and at least for the last decade. And it's not just Central Asia and South Asia; it's also the Middle East. And so this is sort of like a global phenomenon. But I think that to Dan's point, and you mentioned it in your piece in Foreign Affairs on Pakistan, I think that it's not just the bad relationship with Pakistan that you tried to sort of say, okay, how can we get beyond it? I think Pakistan has a lot of internal issues that sort of suppress its utility to be able to deal with Afghanistan. Mm-hmm. So if you're the United States and you just want to deal with Afghanistan, and I'll get to Central Asia in a bit, but if you just want to deal with Afghanistan because you're no longer there, then there's not much that the Pakistanis can do other than sort of hold the dam, if you will. and prevent the water from spilling over. And even that isn't happening. Then the question is, who are you left with to be able to leverage Afghanistan? It's certainly not the Chinese, because they were looking at you to deal with this, and they're still scrambling. You don't have a relationship with the Iranians, and this is their strategic rear anyway. They're looking at the Middle East as their priority. That leaves the Central Asian states. So going back to your point, that if the Uzbeks are keeping the lights on, if the Turkmens are doing the same thing, yes, the Tajiks are making noise, but then there's the Kazakhs, whom you have, Washington has probably the most closest relationship with. Then it could be that, just because you're still in post-Afghanistan mode, that you should all the more deal with the Central Asian states as a means of managing this. And from that, maybe we can find a way to have a relationship that is meaningful with the Central Asian states, because you can't just jump from, we just left Afghanistan, and so you're asking us to go back to Central Asia. That's not going to happen. That's not how governments sort of think about it in the political calculus. They need to be told, this is why you need to do this. And I think that it's in the Central Asian states' interest to make sure that even they're noticing what's happening. Look, they're dealing with Pakistan because they know that Pakistan can't do it by itself, and Pakistan is in a very, very vulnerable position itself. So they're stepping up. Can we help that stepping up to be and make that a springboard for broader relations with Central Asia?
I absolutely agree. In fact, both things can coexist. Uzbekistan can build strong relations with Russia and Pakistan and still be interested in collaboration, stronger ties with the United States. And Senator Safoyev from Uzbekistan was recently here, and he said that he just mentioned that no president has ever visited Central Asian countries, and how come? We've been there, open, especially under Mirziyoyev, to collaborate with the United States. So there is the need. There is the it can be both. It can be cooperating with those who are against U.S. presence and discredit U.S. presence, rightly so, in Central Asia and South Asia, and those, and also be open to even stronger ties with the United States.
And I think this is a really important point, because as Russia and China, we think about the great power rivalries, and we talked about the agency that these countries have. But as the U.S. steps away, its absence becomes more desirable, right? As China, look, Russia is putting enormous pressure on the Central Asian states right now, especially Uzbekistan, Tajikistan as well, to join their Eurasian Economic Union. This is a political, for the reasons Erica has pointed out, society is not necessarily where it was 20 years ago. There is, increased nationalism, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan especially, against Russian language. We've seen this tick up over the past 2 or 3 years. Russia wants this Eurasian Economic Union. All these countries talk about multi-vectored foreign policies. Well, here comes the United States. When Russia, is putting more pressure to join this union, China is putting pressure with its debts and its BRIs, and here comes the United States with Build Back Better World. Right? No, I'm just joking. That's a pretty sad strategy, if you ask me. But it creates this space, right? It does create
monopoly.
It gives them the multi-vector stuff they want, which I think is what they really want.
Exactly.
Right? They don't want Russia. They don't want China. They want a multi-vector. So the U.S. has to create space, but I think the U.S. has to create a space that goes beyond terrorism. And goes beyond democracy promotion. There's got to be some other kind of economic engagement that's a positive sum engagement, that's not just about negative things or finger wagging, right? That everybody in society sees. Because one of the reasons that the democracy promotion work has been so discredited is because of Russia, right? And so these words now have foreign policy meanings, right?
It translates as colored revolution. It
just translates to the United States. When you say these words, it doesn't mean what we think it means. I think for many people, it means it has a foreign accent to it, right?
Right. This has gotten me thinking thinking because, for example, in the Middle East, the United States has already begun to lay some of the groundwork and the foundation for kind of a post-security framework. I mean, it's certainly not rock solid, but as we've seen drawdown in Iraq, drawdown in the Gulf, the United States has emboldened some of its partners there. It has tried to forge rapprochement between certain countries. But in Central Asia, I just haven't seen much of that, and especially with this recent example of the U.S. coordinating with Russia to see if there is a potential, opportunity where they could have access to, intelligence and observing movements in Afghanistan. It's clear that the United States is scrambling to find a foothold in the region, if at all. And going back to your point about, military education, trying to draw and incorporate and involve more voices and more figures from the region in our military education, do you think that we are already behind the curve in trying to encourage a regional security framework that can operate in the wake of U.S. presence in Afghanistan? Do you think that we could have a system, not to say that would, of course, work on autopilot, but serve some American security interests, which is, of course, preventing instability from growing out of Afghanistan? Or do you think that we're behind the curve? There's not a possibility. And if you guys could limit your responses to maybe like a minute or so, because we have about 4 minutes left.
Would you start? Me?
Okay. Oh, yeah.
So, okay, we are behind the curve on certain issues. On military educations, that's for sure. I'm puzzled. In the 7 years that I've been with NDU, 7, 8 years, we only recently started admitting students from Central Asia to study for year-long master programs. Wow. Yes. And that's unfortunate because now that we need, and for instance, the students that do come to NDU, they do study the very regional issues from this holistic academic perspective that they produce the kind of analysis and knowledge that is needed in Central Asian countries today. So we are behind the curve in that sense. But in terms of, let's say, supporting independent journalism, supporting environmental initiatives in Central Asia, and different civil society activist initiatives. I think this is the dynamics is pretty representative of what we see around the world as well in Central Asia, and a lot of the Western support for investigations of corruption have paid off, although the results are yet to be seen. But it is vital. The cooperation and the connections are important, and the fact that we see Central Asian countries to be so authoritarian today is unfortunate, but it's a global problem anyways. So so we are behind the curve in some issues, but we are kind of somewhere in the middle, average on other issues too, in Central Asia. Yeah.
I think I've said a lot on this topic, just in terms of there's opportunities for engagement. I don't think that the U.S. really has a broad strategy. It doesn't have an economic strategy. And to me, without an economic strategy, that's where you've got landlocked states. Double landlocked state, right? So you have these states, and what do they want? I mean, why do they want to negotiate? Why are they hanging out with the Taliban? It's not because there's a normative affinity there. It's an economic need, right? You've got growing populations, like huge population growth in Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Afghanistan, right? I mean, how are these people going to find work aside from going to Russia? Uzbekistan's been trying to answer this question. Tajikistan hasn't really been answering that question at all. So the economic engagement to me is key. If you can help these countries solve that problem, I think that's how you win hearts and minds, but not through infrastructure, not through building things, but actually through engagement.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Martin?
Yeah, as you were asking this question, you made a comparison with the Middle East and a shift from U.S. attention from the Middle East to East Asia, and it's interesting, and certainly the withdrawal from Afghanistan looks and reminds us of our withdrawal from Iraq, but the American presence in the Middle East, as compared to Central Asia, is night and day. The depth of attention and focus and resources that we have now for really generations placed on the Middle East, there's nothing like that in Central Asia. And I think that that should be an expectation setting or expectation management for us. The kinds of things that we can do in Central Asia, there are real things we can do, and some have already been pointed out. I would give 3 cheers to points on education, on journalists, on certain NGO support, and so on. These things all make a lot of sense, and nobody else is going to do them. The Chinese is not going to do it. The Russians not going to do it. So if we don't do it, really no one will. So yes, keep doing that, but set a manageable bar. And as Jen was talking about economic engagement, economic integration, what are the tools that the United States brings to bear in that part of the world, especially, to engender that? I don't see them. We haven't developed that toolkit. Some of the generalized tools that we used to have, sorry, I'm going a little long, but some of the tools that we used to have on promoting free trade, those have played out. Either they played out because they were successful, or they played out because the American public's no longer willing to do more on those areas. So I would say, work at the margins, do the kinds of things that have already been identified, and then, because of our absence, assuming things don't get incredibly worse and we don't come back in some worse way, we may start to look more appealing over time. Play for a little time here. The region is going to stay. I don't see a huge sort of immediate near-term opportunity for us to jump into. That's part of the problem. And neither do I see a shift. The Chinese influence is growing, expanding across this region, but that too won't happen overnight either. So this is a longer-term game that we should be seeing it in those terms.
Excellent.
Yeah, no, I agree with all my colleagues, and Dan made a point earlier, which is probably hits the nail on the head, is that what is it exactly that we're going to be doing there? And I totally agree with you that it needs to start off slow. The reason, and you mentioned the Middle East, the reasons were completely different for getting into the Middle East. We were inheriting it from the British. There were oil, security, and Cold War logic and all of that. This region was tucked away from us. This region was part of the Soviet Union until 30 years ago. So there was no access to it. So in some ways, what we've done is understandable. Even if it's not right, it's still understandable that, why does this region not get the attention, has not gotten the attention that it deserves, is because it's just all very new. And then for the past 20 years, we were stuck on its southern flank in Afghanistan. And then there's Iran there. Now we're coming to terms with China. And so maybe we will begin to, as Afghanistan goes into the rear view mirror, increasingly, and we start to think of China, then this somehow, Central Asia allows us to sort of not just dump Afghanistan and embrace, the challenge from China, but kind of do both somehow. But yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, we have a lot of thinking to do here in terms of how we can engage. There are some low-hanging fruit, education, but beyond that, democracy promotion is not going to work because you alienate the regimes, and that doesn't do any good for the public. And infrastructure, how competitive are we going to be with the Chinese? Let's just face it, they're next door.
Excellent. Well, we are running out of time, and I just want to thank you all for a really productive and interesting, fascinating discussion. I really learned a lot from you, and I hope our audience members did as well. For those watching, thank you so much for tuning in. We really appreciate it. And if you are looking for more content from the Newlines Institute, please make sure to check out our website at newlinesinstitute.org. Also, if you would like to have a recording of this interview, make sure to check out our YouTube channel. We will have it posted there shortly after this interview concludes. And of course, please take care. Thank you, and have a great rest of your week.